Ladies and gentlemen, as you're finding your seats for the service, just a reminder to turn your cell phones off or silent. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, interment will take place at Bethel Memorial Garden in Arbor Crest Cemetery. The cemetery is located at 2521 Glazier Way. Following the interment service, family and friends of David Aminoff will be gathering at the Nature Cove Community Room, 2115 Nature Cove, until 5 p.m. and on Sunday from 3 to 5. Minion prayers will be held at 7 p.m. on Thursday and Sunday at the Nature Cove Community Room. It is suggested that those who wish to further honor the memory of David Aminoff may do so by making a contribution to the Aminoff Endowment Fund, University of Michigan Department of Biological Chemistry, or the Beth Israel Congregation of Ann Arbor, the Aminoff Entry Door Fund, or the Magen David Adam in Illinois. All this information is available out in the lobby and also on our website, irakaufman.com.
We begin our service with the 23rd Psalm. Mizmor leDavid, Adonai Roi lo echsar. Binot deshe yarbitzeni, al mei menuchot yinahaleni. Nafshi shovev yancheni v'magle tzedek leman shemo. Gam ki elech begeitz al mavet lo irara ki ata imadi. Shivtecha umishantecha hema yinachamuni. Ta'aroch lefanai shulchan neged sorarai. Di shanta v'shemen roshi kosir vayam. Ach tov v'chesed yerdefuni kol yemei chayai, v'shavti beveit Adonai le'orech yamim. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. God has me lie down in green pastures. God leads me beside the still waters. God guides me on paths of righteousness. God revives my soul for the sake of God's glory. Though I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your staff and your rod do comfort me. You set a table in sight of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall abide in the house of the Lord forever. I read from the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes. A season is set for everything, a time for every experience under heaven, a time for planting and a time for reaping, a time for keeping and a time for discarding, a time for loving and a time for hating, a time for embracing and a time for refraining, a time for slaying and a time for healing, a time for laughing and a time for weeping, a time for dancing and a time for wailing, a time for birthing and a time for dying, a time for speaking and a time for silence, a time for seeking and a time for losing.
I'll read from an interpretation of Psalm 15. First, from the Hebrew, Mizmor leDavid, Adonai mi yagor b'ohalecha mi yishkan b'har kodshecha. Holech tamim u'foel tzedek v'dover emet bilvavo. A Psalm of David, do we deserve to enter God's sanctuary? Can we merit a place in the presence of God? Live with integrity, do what is right. Speak the truth without deceit. With no slander upon your tongue, do no evil to others. Do not mistreat your neighbor. Make these deeds your own, and you and your memory shall stand firm forever. Helen, to you, to Debbie and Steve, Susan and Janet, and to Seth, and to all of the family gathered here, my condolences. It's an honor to be able to say a few brief words in memory of husband, father, father-in-law, grandfather, uncle, cousin, and our dear friend David. This week in the Torah we read Parshat Matot and Parshat Maseh, two Torah portions. And the second of those two, Parshat Maseh, begins with one of my favorite sections of the entire Torah. I might be alone in that, but it's one of my favorite sections. It's the itinerary of the people on their journey from the Exodus to the edge of the border of the promised land of Canaan. And it's a very specific itinerary. It goes through all of these different places, one after the other. We all have itineraries in our lives. We all travel many places, but I think it's fair to say that David, Alav Shalom, had an itinerary that was probably longer and more twisted and turned geographically than most of us here in this room. I lost track completely. I know from Bukhara to London to Jerusalem to New York, and it went on and on. But more important than the places he went was the influences that they had in his life and the inspiration that he provided in all of those places, and the destination of those places, namely Ann Arbor, because I know how much this community meant to him, how much the university meant to him, how much the synagogue meant to him, and how important a part of all of those institutions he was. My own impressions of David during the years I knew him were just that a very kind smile, a very gentle and quiet soul. I don't know what it was like at the university. I wasn't there, but I know here. I always loved to see him and loved to see his smile and his respect for this community, this institution, and for me personally, I always felt that. And when I last talked to him a month or so ago, he was in certain senses at peace. I know the last few years, perhaps, months had been very difficult, but I think he was at peace. And at age 98, to be able to look back on a life not only of varied itinerary, but such varied experiences and such dedication to his work, to his family, to the community, to the congregation is so important. And so it's an honor for me to be able to be standing here today as we bring him to the last step in his itinerary, as we stand on the border before he enters his promised land and returns to his eternal home. We have an expression, Bitzor Chaim, that we ask that the deceased remain in the bond of in the bond of life, and that is done by continuing to tell his stories, continuing to remember what he's taught us, and there is so much, and we have so much to be grateful for. So as we mark the end of his journey, and as he goes to his eternal home, we know he will remain Bitzor Chaim in the bond of life. My condolences to you and to the family and to everyone today.
Almighty God, Ribono Shel Olam, Lord of the living and the dead, the hearts of your children who mourn are heavy with grief. Give them comfort. Help them to remember the triumphs and the joys in the life of David Aminoff. Help them to treasure what is theirs because David lived. Help them to meet grief with courage, to confront the angel of death with life. When despair threatens, when faith falters, sustain us all, O Lord, our refuge and our strength, our ever-present help, and let us say, Amen. Our hearts are heavy this afternoon as we come together to bid farewell to David Aminoff, a most beloved husband, father, and grandfather, uncle, relative, and friend, and a treasured member of this community, which has been his home for over 60 years. I am here to honor my friendship with David and Helen that goes back 53 years to the time I arrived in Ann Arbor in 1971. I first met Helen, who, as some of you know, helped guide me through many of the practical details of life that I, as a single, newly minted rabbi, needed help with. I soon met David and could tell immediately that here was a beautiful human being, a man of learning and culture, who carried himself with dignity and grace, gentle and caring to those around him, and full of wisdom. Here was a true man of science, devoted to scientific research, truly passionate about science and about his own work. David's life was one of great accomplishment, and future researchers will undoubtedly build on his work. His memory will live on in his family forever. David's life spanned 3 continents. He was born in Kokand, Bukhara, now Uzbekistan, home to an ancient community of Bukharan Jews, a community that for generations was steeped in tradition and love of Zion. David was born in 1926, the second of 2 sons born to Abba Baruch and Bluria Aminoff. It was an unsettled time in that outpost of the former Russian Empire in those early days of the Soviet Union, and the pogroms targeting the local Jewish community led David's parents to seek a new life in the land of Israel. Unfortunately, David's father died suddenly in Moscow while en route to the land of Israel. But David's mother continued her journey, reaching Jerusalem, where David's grandparents were well established in the city's Bukharan quarter. Sadly, David's mother died several years later, and by age 5, David and his brother Isaac were orphans. David and Isaac were taken in by their grandfather, and upon his demise, they were cared for by other family members. An uncle brought them to London, where they attended boarding school. During the Blitz, they were evacuated to the countryside. All in all, it was a difficult childhood. But through it all, the 2 brothers developed a tight bond, which helped them survive the vicissitudes of their early years. David earned a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Physiology with first-class honors from the Chelsea Polytechnic at the University of London. He joined a research group and continued his studies, earning a PhD in biochemistry from the University of London in 1949. The State of Israel had just been born, and David and Isaac decided to return to Israel to help build the Jewish homeland. David joined the staff of Magen David Adom assisting in the establishment of the Marcus Institute for Blood Fractionation while continuing his research. In 1955, he was sent to Europe and the United States to visit blood banks. Soon he was engaged as an exchange scientist at Columbia University. David and Helen met over Easter weekend of 1956. It was towards the end of David's sojourn in New York, and one of David's uncles by marriage encouraged him to visit one of his cousins, who happened to be Helen's grandmother. At the time, Helen was visiting in New York from Montreal, where she lived. Upon their meeting at Helen's grandmother's home, Helen and David spent the night talking into the wee hours of the morning. By June, they were married. It was the beginning of a beautiful, loving marriage of 68 years. David and Helen complemented one another beautifully. Helen, outgoing and always on the go, and David, contemplative, quieter, and reserved. Each was a tower of support for the other. Their lives were totally intertwined. Together they built a family and nurtured a beautiful, warm Jewish home for Debbie, Susan, and Janet. I remember my many visits to that home and to the family dinners where David held a revered place at the table and opened the meal with the traditional hamotzi. David, with his high aesthetic sense, helped design the garden, always a source of joy for the family. Together, David and Helen enjoyed travel to Europe and Israel many times, and several years ago, even visited David's ancestral home in Kokand as they traveled to the Bukharan heartland. David loved music and art, and he had an avid interest in history. David fully supported Helen in her many community involvements. I would suspect that if Helen was ever upset at something that happened in the congregation, that David was a calming influence. David's attachment to Judaism was solid. He was a proud member of Beth Israel, a regular attendee at Minyan for many years, and served on the congregation's Board of Education. David's love of Israel and of Hebrew was steadfast. In recent years, as David's health waned, Helen was fully there for David, caring for him and supporting him lovingly to his very last breaths on this earth. David's illustrious career at the University of Michigan spanned some 60 years. In 1960, he joined the Rackham Arthritis Research Institute, moving to the Simpson Memorial Institute in 1962 with a joint appointment to the departments of internal medicine and biological chemistry. Later returning full-time to the Department of Biological Chemistry, where he pursued his research in red blood cells. Whenever I spoke to David of his work, I was awed by the passion that he brought to it, and by his drive in pursuing his research, always hopeful that his studies and experiments would help in combating disease and would benefit humanity. David pursued his research for as long as he physically could. Though David officially retired in 1999, he was able to benefit from additional grants and continued to work in his lab until COVID hit in 2020, some 60 years after he began his work at the U of M. As his work at the university winded down, David and Helen established the Aminoff Endowment Fund, and the ceremony at the inauguration of the endowment was a true high point of their years of association with the university. Work and family. These were the two main pivots of David's life. David was a loving father to Debbie, Susan, and Janet. He took great pride in them. He was always there for them. As they grew into adulthood, he gave them space to make their own decisions. Family bonds were forged over vacations and travel. David introduced them to music and chess. He modeled his work ethic for them. He was an adoring, loving grandfather to Seth and was deeply proud of him. David is mourned deeply today by Helen, by Debbie and Steve, by Susan, by Janet, and by Seth. And as David's bond with his brother Isaac was strong, so was his bond with Isaac's children and grandchildren, who today mourn the passing of their beloved uncle and great-uncle. David's long journey through life that began in Kokand, Bukhara, has come to its end as David's soul now returns to his Maker. In his life's work, David sought to unlock scientific secrets and to bring his knowledge to bear to make this a better world, the Taken Olam. David touched many along the way, friends, colleagues, students, friends, and above all, his family. His memory will live on powerfully in his family, whom he inspired and loved so deeply. We here at Beth Israel will keep David's memory alive. And we here have another very important task: to support Helen as she regains the strength she needs to go on affirming life without her beloved David. I hope we will all rally to Helen's side in the days and months ahead. I hope that some of the caring which Helen has shown to so many others will now come back to her in the support that we will offer her. May the soul of David Aminoff, David ben Abba Baruch Ubluria, be bound in the bond of everlasting life. Tehi nishmato tzrura b'tzror hachayim. And let us say, Amen. We now call on David's daughter, Susan Aminoff.
Okay, see how this goes. I'm going to say a few words for a man who spoke very few words. But his communicative style was just substantive and influential and meaning in ways beyond words. His character was elusive and also one that wasn't so easy to capture in words. I would say there were rare qualities that came together in just the right chemistry, if you'll pardon the pun. The words all of you have been using in messages to us, and thank you so much for the voicemails and the emails have been so inspiring, are many of the words Rabbi Kensky just said. Grace, dignity, kind, gentle, humble, understated, sense of humanity, a unique sweetness about him, and the word that just keeps coming back up is humility, humility. He was patient, he was calm, and he was always trying to lower the volume. I'm sure you can't imagine that was necessary in our household. A friend of mine who met him said, who's Italian, said, "He's a piece of bread." I said, "What exactly does that mean?" And he said, he explained it to me, and the way I interpreted it was just such an interesting juxtaposition, that it was simple ingredients but very complex output. And just pure, straightforward comfort, but with gravity and substance and nourishment. That feels right. I do know his foundational ingredients were love and devotion to his family. Not just us, Mom and my sisters and Steph and Steve, but his brother Isaac, as you've heard so much about. They were attached at the hip. And his love and sense of responsibility to Dan and Michelle, our cousins, and their children, and their collective 10 grandchildren. They all knew him well. They all shared a very special connection with him, even the 2-year-olds. And also we saw it in his really palpable love and devotion for Nana. The kindness and generosity that he showed for her, and the chivalry was just always so impressive to me growing up. In her later years, when he sensed that she just needed her dignity in a certain way and what it required, he'd help her navigate that as well. His family in Israel, his aunts, uncles, cousins, their kids, and their kids' kids, and their kids' kids, and so on, and so on, and so on. You can drop a name out of a hat, and Mom and Dad could tell you, well, that person is and that's how they're connected. I can promise those of you listening on Zoom, I will never remember how we're connected, but I'm glad that we are. And I look forward to our generations carrying on that legacy. You are his roots, and you were very, very important to him. We went to Israel many times in our childhood, and we lived there for 6 months when I was 12 in 1972. Felt like we went to a Shabbat dinner at a different relative's house every Friday night for 6 months, and I don't think we ever went to the same family twice, which I can't still even fathom. Right before we left for Israel, Aunt Adina came to visit. She was his mother's sister. When Mom and Dad got married, a relative in London told Mom, you know, he has family in Russia. We have a thread there. That was all she needed. So she pulled on that thread and then started communicating in her Russian to his aunt. And somehow, like out of Kansas, in this case out of Tashkent, Aunt Adina came to visit for a month before we left for Israel. Dad was 46. Isaac would have been in his 50s. 5 children amongst them. These were her sister's children. She hadn't seen them in 45 years. We don't know if she ever met Dad. And she witnessed all of us in American life, getting our ears pierced, Debbie getting her driver's license, and my bat mitzvah from the front row, openly going to synagogue, which wasn't something that was allowed in Russia at the time. But what I remember most vividly from that month is every single night for a month, Dad and Aunt Adina, after dinner, would move into the living room with a tall glass of hot tea, chai in our culture, and pumpkin seeds, because it was November, and they would sit across from each other, and they would look at each other and nod and smile and just be with each other. And unless Mom came in to jump in and translate or have a bit of conversation with them, they would just sit like that. I would watch them and I would just think of 45 years of unspoken questions and love and bonds and thoughts, and you could feel it like electricity going between them. Talk about the power of nonverbal communication. Dad also had a passion for culture, as you've heard a lot about. He loved flower arranging. He and Mom designed and built stone by stone a 2-tiered, 60-plus rose bush garden. That was just spectacular, and Dad was always tasked with making flower arrangements for any hostess or special event. He researched and built a Japanese rock garden. He taught me how to grow vegetables, and he studied bonsai. My friend Lori Frankel, who's here today, said to me, we were once with a group of people, and they said, explain your home dynamics for you. And Lori said, oh, I can do the Aminoffs for you. She said, so just think of a loose dining room table with everybody sort of sitting around, and Helen's at one end, Mrs. Aminoff is at one end, holding court, and everybody's interrupting each other and getting louder and louder and stepping on each other, and Dr. Aminoff is just at the other end, not saying a word, but taking in every word and just snipping the bonsai or rearranging his flowers. So that summed it up pretty well. He made a mean whiskey sour, as you read, and he loved playing chess with his grandson Seth. And then there was his work. He loved his work. And as part of our childhood, in addition to bicycles and apple picking and all those sorts of things, we got to help him prove his grants. Polysaccharide, whatever, I don't know how to spell half these things, but they're in my head. And he was still working until COVID, as Rabbi Kensky said. When he was told he couldn't come in anymore, that just really pummeled his spirit. That really broke him. And Mom gave him the idea of writing a summation of everything he had done so that the torch could be carried forward with the next generation. And Debbie, Janet, and I got enlisted to can you find this experiment from 1978 and go into boxes and find things to try and help him get the bibliography and whatever, but we did. And he was published, and then he and Mom established the endowment fund, and the reception was earlier this year. Thank you, Amanda. And one of the most meaningful encounters that I saw there, a young woman came up to me and she said, I left my kids at school for an extra half hour. I asked them to please hold them because I just couldn't not be here today. But I was wondering if you could put me to the head of the line to say hello to your dad. And I said, of course. So she came up to the front and she said, Dr. Aminoff, I'm so-and-so, do you remember me? And he said, I'm sorry, I don't. And she said, that's all right. I was your intern here when I was an undergrad, and I was responsible for cleaning your test tubes. And he said, okay. And she goes, and we were told, don't talk to the scientists. But she said, I did. I asked you a question, and you answered me, and then you shared more of what you were doing and why you were doing it. And you started asking me about my work, and then you started pointing me to articles and things that I might find interesting. And that kindness and generosity never left me, and I've carried it forward my whole life, and I just had to come here today to say thank you for that. And I think that's a really telling story of how he operated. My memory about his work is a little different. I have a story that some of you who know me know. And we were coming home from Israel through France, and Dad had been working on an experiment for years, and it was so close to coming to fruition. And he found another scientist, and they had duplicated each other's work, which in science is a good thing. And they decided to pool their grant money and collaborate. And for whatever reason, the other guy was going to get top billing when they won the Nobel Prize. And I remember saying to him, you must be so bummed. And he's like, bummed? Why would I be bummed? And I'm like, because you've been doing this work all these years, and now he's going to get the credit. And he looked at me and he goes, Susan, I don't do the work because of who gets the credit, and neither should you. Well, as a 13-year-old, that was quite enlightening. And I'm like, what do you mean you don't do it for who gets the credit? And he said, no. You need to do it because it's the right thing to do, because it can improve the quality of people's lives, and because it can create progress in the world. If that's what you look in the mirror every day for and know that that's your moral compass, you'll be just fine. Well, that sent my life in a whole different trajectory, and I followed those words, and about 25, 30 years ago, I guess, I replayed that conversation with him, and he listened, and he said, oh, really? Thanks for sharing that with me. And he said, as a parent, you have no idea what's going to resonate with your children. I could have just as easily said, can you please take out the garbage? But he had an appreciation and an approach for life, and I think that sums that up, that it defied so many odds. He had such a difficult childhood. He never exercised a day in his life except for a lousy tennis game with a serve that, remember that face, Mom, when he would serve, and a questionable skill in sailing. But he fully immersed in whatever he was doing, and he always had fun with it. He had a very special way of experiencing the world, and he led by example. but I would say his biggest hallmark was his sense of appreciation. He was not a guy that would say, okay, thanks. No matter what you did, just sharpen his pencils, figured out how to help him save a file in a different folder, or help him get up out of his chair and get balanced on his walker. He would stop, he would make you stop, he would look you in the eye, and if he could touch your hand, he would, and he would smile and he would say, thank you. And I think that was just such a very special thing, and that leads me to his posse. This is a whole nother team who made it possible for him to be at home and helped lower the volume and go peacefully on his own terms. And that's the posse over here who called him Mr. David. Sonia, you have been with us since Nana, and through Uncle Isaac's wife, Auntie Tova, and then now to Dad. Your smile lit up his day, every day, and lightened his heart. No matter what curveballs there were, and believe me, there were plenty these past couple of years, you stepped up, you stepped in, and you made it work. Tanetta and Tina, the calm and tenderness that you handled him with were just amazing to behold, especially right after a fall or another incident where he was feeling skittish and unsure. It was amazing to watch. Shabbat was his favorite night of the week, and you know why, Tanetta. And he looked forward to your Monday, Wednesday, and Friday visits every week. Quincy, Eunice, Deborah, Jackie, he loved how you cared for him. He loved it. And he used to share with me how amazed he was that you would all do the exact same task, but just in the most subtle, nuanced, different ways. And he just marveled at that. But he really appreciated and he noticed it, and he loved how you cared for him. Appreciation aside, he loved getting to know each of you and your families. And he loved it when he brought your children to work so he could play with them. At the helm of all this shift juggling and task choreography and supply company fighting and Medicare rule breaking and on and on and on that this sprawling 24-hour operation takes to keep afloat, and that's just a snippet of it, was the fortitude of his beloved wife and our mom, Helen. As every one of you in this room know firsthand, if there is ever anything that needs getting done, especially the things that people say can't be done, this is the woman that's going to get it done. The irony of it is, Mom, and I don't know if you know that Dad told me when he met you, he thought he'd have to take care of you. He was convinced that after he and Isaac had traveled the world and practically raised themselves, that taking a woman of upbringing from New York City and Montreal would mean he'd have to manage every detail, oversee the life of both of you envisioned together, and manage all of it. He said, can you imagine how surprised I was when I realized who I married? I think he hung on so long because he didn't want to leave you. And now, maybe from his new perch, he'll be able to take care of you like he imagined when he was 22, when you were 22. COVID, like for so many of us, also gave us great gifts. My sisters and I got to spend a lot of quality time with him. We would ask him, what are you struggling with? He was never dismissive or embarrassed or no, nothing. He was comfortable in who he was and in being vulnerable, and he would answer us honestly. Sometimes it was his arm was bothering him, sometimes his pajamas were twisted, sometimes it was world events. Recently, it was more about his coughing and choking spasms that he was having issues with. But towards the end, it was more about really, crossing the divide. How do you know you're ready? What do you do once you know? Are you able to will it into being? What is on the other side? What's the right way to say goodbye? So many questions we discuss. And he was really just struggling with letting go. I'm glad he found his path there and that he's now at peace. So while I'm sure the sadness and the grief will come in tsunami-sized waves for us soon enough, today I just feel proud. Proud that he was ours. Proud that he found a way to work through his emotional struggles and find his way to peace on his own terms. And honored to be able to share these stories with you and to be a part of his legacy. I'm grateful that we had him with all his faculties and his gentleness and his humor intact until he was 98 and a half. As most of you know, he went peacefully in his sleep. We all always speak to him on Sundays, and this last Sunday he was very engaged and stayed on the phone with us all a little bit longer than usual. Sunday night, he went to bed after dinner and he had a very bad coughing spasm. And he called Mom and asked her to come in from the kitchen and sit with him until the cough medicine took hold and talk to him until his coughing calmed down, which he did. And then he asked her to hold his hand until he fell asleep, and she did. And then one day he was gone. So when you talk about designing your own life and figuring out how to make it wrapped up in a bow, you just can't ask for better than that. And when I think of Dad, and whenever I'm asked who he was or how would you characterize him, I'm just going to say, you just can't ask for better than that. Thank you.
Please rise for the memorial prayer. El malei rachamim, shochein b'meromim, hamtzei minucha nechona, tachat kanfei hashechina, במעלות קדושים וטהורים כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים לנשמת דוד בן אבא ברוך ובלוריה שהלך לעולמו. בגן עדן תהא מנוחתו, הנע בעל הרחמים, הסתירהו בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו. אדוני הוא נחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר O God, exalted and full of compassion, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure to the soul of David ben Abba Baruch Uvluria, David Aminoff, who is gone to his eternal home. Master of mercy, we beseech you, remember all the worthy and righteous deeds that he performed in the land of the living. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. The Lord is his portion. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, just a reminder that we will not be traveling in procession to the cemetery. For those of you wishing to continue to the interment service, we would ask that once the casket leaves the chapel, you go directly to your cars and drive on your own to the cemetery. We will allow ample time before starting the service. At this time, I'd like to ask for the pallbearers.